You send all kinds of structured and unstructured data into Dynatrace, from logs, metrics, traces, events, business events, security events, and more. And you need a way to provide the right permissions, even down to restricting certain portions of a log line to only certain individuals or teams, so that ultimately the right people see only the data that they need at the right time. In this video, we'll cover the ways and means to do exactly that. So let's get started. Let's start with Grail. Grail is the data storage and access layer in Dynatrace. So the question then becomes, is Grail a single location of storage? And how can I organize, partition, and provide permissions on the data that I send into and store in Grail? Well, let's start from the course's permissions and boundaries and get more granular as we go in. All data in Grail is stored in buckets, and data can only be stored in a single bucket, meaning if I send a log line in, it gets stored in one bucket and one bucket only. Each bucket has a defined data type, for example, logs, and there are a number of default buckets for different data types, so that on day one out of the box, you don't need to do anything. By default, data will be stored in these default buckets, and each bucket has a predefined retention period for the data that lives in it. In other words, without doing anything at all, logs, for example, are going to be stored in the default _logs bucket, and they'll be stored by default for 35 days. Now, Dynatrace also has default policies, such as read logs and read events, that you can provide to users. Now notice that to read logs, you need to access the buckets containing logs and the logs data type itself. Now imagine you're dealing with logs and spans, and you're sending in some log records and some spans, both of which come from the cluster A Kubernetes cluster. And the scenario here is that you need to give access to a team for only those logs and spans and nothing else. The easiest way to do this is to leave them with access to the default read logs and read spans policies, so they can read everything, but you then need to restrict to only logs and spans from cluster A. And to do that, you need to create a policy boundary. Now, a boundary is added or attached to a policy, and it effectively becomes a where clause. So create a new user group and attach the read logs policy and the boundary to the policy. Repeat the process for the read spans, and it looks like this. The advantage here, of course, is that to adjust permissions, you only need to adjust that one boundary. You don't need to adjust every user group. As you've seen, we already have the bucket permissions and boundaries set up correctly for two people to see different data which resides in the same bucket. But what if two different people should have two different views of exactly the same log line, for example? Now, in this log line, the supplier portion is considered sensitive. Two people, Alice and Bob, need to be able to see the data, but Bob isn't allowed to see the supplier name. At first, this might seem impossible, right? I mean, to give two different users different access to the same log line. Actually, it's not. We use a concept called record level permissions in Dynatrace. The first step is to extract the supplier into its own field. Now, you can use the OpenTelemetry collector or OpenPipeline to achieve this. So here's the configuration for the collector. This configuration reads a log file and uses the regex parser to create a new attribute called supplier on the log record itself. The second operator redacts the original log line, replacing that supplier part of the log line with stars. If you don't want to spin up a separate component, you can use the Dynatrace OpenPipeline to achieve this as well. Now, if you want this rule to apply enterprise-wide for every incoming log, you can modify the default logs pipeline. An example of this would be to redact credit card numbers, for example, because you know that wherever they come from, you're not going to want those. If you'd like to be a bit more targeted, maybe per team or per microservice, you can create dedicated open pipelines to achieve the same thing on a more granular basis. And that's what we're going to do here. So create a new pipeline and add a DQL processing step that works exactly like the collector. We find and extract the supplier information into a new field, we redact the supplier code in the original logline, and then we create a matching dynamic route to ensure that any logs containing supplier equals is processed with this new custom pipeline in OpenPipeline. In either case, whether you're using the collector or the OpenPipeline, the result is a logline that looks like this. Now the content has been extracted into its own field, we can use a concept called Fieldsets to provide permissions. In short, you can use Fieldsets to mark fields as sensitive and thus hide fields that you don't want certain users or groups of users to see. So we already have a field called supplier and we need to define a new field set that contains that field. We can do this via the API. But remember our original scenario, Alice is allowed and should have access to the supplier code. So how do we adjust her permissions? First, we move Alice into a new user group in Dynatrace. Just like before, we create a policy that gives this new group access to buckets and logs, and then we create a boundary which provides access to the new field set that we created via the API. We add the boundary only to Alice's group and not Bob's, and therefore Bob can see the redacted log but not the sensitive field, and Alice can see the whole thing. Of course, I've been talking about logs here, but this works with any of the data types in Dynatrace, not just logs. Up to now, we've talked about restricting access to the default data buckets based on policies and boundaries. But what if you want to store data for longer than the default buckets allow? Well, you can actually create your own data buckets and set custom retention periods for the data within those buckets. If you'd like to see how to do this, follow the link above. I have another video which walks you through the entire process. So whether you want to restrict permissions at a very broad level to particular data types or get very granular and specific, now you know that using the OpenTelemetry collector or OpenPipeline and Grail in combination with Fieldsets and buckets, you can accommodate whatever restrictions or permissions you need on data access. As always, I hope this has been useful. Please let me know in the comments if there's anything that you'd like to know or a scenario that you'd like covered in a future video. Thanks so much. I'll see you again very soon. Bye.